The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Thomas Blackwood's neck as he adjusted the worn leather brim of his hat. At 42, he wasn't young anymore, but neither was he old by frontier standards, just weathered, like the sandstone formations that punctuated the harsh landscape around him. His horse, a sturdy paint he called Sergeant, plodded steadily through the arid basin, both of them feeling the effects of 3 days without a proper water source. The canteen at Thomas's hip sloshed with precious little remaining, perhaps enough for another half-day if he rationed carefully. Thomas had earned the peculiar nickname, Virgin, not from any truth about his personal life, but from his steadfast refusal to kill a man. In 15 years on the frontier, he'd drawn his Colt Navy revolver countless times, but had never taken a human life. Some men respected this, others mocked him mercilessly for it. He'd been a tracker, a cattle driver, and occasionally a bounty hunter who always brought his quarry in alive, a rarity in these untamed territories. His weathered face, framed by a beard streaked with early gray, had seen its share of hardship, but his eyes retained a certain kindness that many men lost after too long in the wilderness. The summer of 1878 had been particularly brutal, even by Arizona Territory standards. The usual watering holes had dried to cracked mud, and tensions between settlers and the Apache bands had escalated as resources grew scarce. Thomas was returning from a failed prospecting venture in the Superstition Mountains, another dream of gold dust washing away like rain in the desert. He'd planned to reach Fort McDowell by nightfall, but Sergeant's increasingly labored breathing told him they might need to make camp sooner. As the sun began its westward descent, Thomas spotted a narrow canyon that might offer some respite from the relentless heat. "Come on, old friend," he murmured to Sergeant, patting the horse's sweat-slicked neck. "Just a little farther and we'll rest." The animal's ears flickered in acknowledgement, but its pace remained painfully slow. Thomas hadn't encountered another soul in 3 days, not unusual in this desolate stretch, but unsettling nonetheless. Apache war parties had been reported moving through these territories, attacking isolated homesteads and travelers. Thomas wasn't one to harbor prejudice against the native peoples. He understood their fight was one of survival, but he was also keenly aware of his vulnerability as a solitary rider in contested lands. As they approached the canyon entrance, Thomas noticed something unusual, a series of small footprints leading into the shadows of the rock walls. They were fresh, made within the last hour, and appeared to belong to a child. Curiosity and concern immediately trumped caution. In this heat, a child alone would be in grave danger. He dismounted, wincing at the stiffness in his joints, and led Sergeant slowly along the track, his free hand resting instinctively on his revolver. The canyon walls provided blessed shade, the temperature dropping several degrees as they ventured deeper into the narrow passage. The whimpering sound was so faint that Thomas almost missed it. He paused, holding his breath to listen more carefully. There it was again, a soft, pained sound that no animal would make. "Hello," he called softly, his voice echoing slightly against the sandstone. "Anyone there?" No response came except another weak whimper. Thomas rounded a bend in the canyon and stopped short at the sight before him. Huddled against the rock face was a small Apache girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. Her dark eyes, glazed with dehydration, regarded him with equal parts fear and desperate hope. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her small frame trembling despite the heat. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the weather-beaten white man and the Apache child, separated by language, culture, and the bloody history between their peoples. Then Thomas saw the crude splint on the girl's leg, fashioned from a broken arrow shaft and strips of fabric. She had fallen, perhaps wandered away from her people, and could not make her way back. Without hesitation, Thomas knelt beside her, moving slowly to avoid frightening her further. "It's all right," he said softly, knowing she likely wouldn't understand his words but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl flinched as he reached toward her but was too weak to move away. Thomas carefully unscrewed his canteen and tilted it toward her cracked lips. Their eyes met, and in that moment Thomas made his decision. Without a second thought, he let her drink deeply, watching as life seemed to flow back into her small body with each precious swallow. When she finished, not a drop remained in his canteen. His own parched throat protested, but Thomas felt no regret. He had seen too much death in his years on the frontier. He would not stand by and watch a child suffer when he had the means to help. As twilight descended over the canyon, Thomas built a small fire and tended to the girl's injured leg, which appeared to be broken just above the ankle. She watched his movements with wary curiosity, occasionally speaking soft words in Apache that he couldn't understand. Thomas shared his meager rations with her, jerky and hardtack, which she accepted hesitantly at first, then devoured with the hunger of one who hadn't eaten in days. Night fell completely, and Thomas wrapped his spare blanket around the child's shoulders before settling on the opposite side of the fire. His throat burned with thirst, and he knew tomorrow would be difficult without water. But as he looked at the sleeping child, her face peaceful now, he felt certain he had done the right thing. Dawn broke with a chorus of unfamiliar bird calls echoing through the canyon. Thomas awoke with a start, his hand automatically reaching for his revolver. Something had changed. The air felt different, charged with an invisible presence. He rose slowly to his feet, scanning their small camp. The girl was still asleep, her breathing steady and improved from the previous evening. Thomas stepped carefully toward the canyon entrance, every sense alert. He didn't have to go far. Standing at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the rising sun, was an Apache warrior. Then another appeared beside him, and another. Within moments, Thomas counted at least 20 warriors, all watching him in complete silence. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly raised both hands to show he was not reaching for his weapon. This could very well be the end of his story, Thomas thought grimly. Even if he managed to draw his revolver, he wouldn't stand a chance against so many. And yet, something in their stance didn't suggest an imminent attack. They were waiting, observing. A movement from behind drew his attention. The little girl had awakened and was hobbling toward him, her splinted leg dragging slightly. She called out in her language, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. The warriors parted, and an older man stepped forward, his face deeply lined with age and authority. The girl spoke rapidly, gesturing toward Thomas and then to her splinted leg, and finally making a drinking motion with her hand. The older man, clearly a chief or medicine man of importance, listened intently, his dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face. When she finished speaking, the chief approached Thomas slowly. Thomas remained perfectly still, hands still raised, aware that his next few moments of life depended entirely on the judgment of this man. The chief stopped a few paces away and spoke a single word that Thomas didn't understand. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, the chief extended his hand in the white man's gesture of greeting. Cautiously, Thomas lowered one hand and clasped the offered forearm. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. The chief spoke again, this time in heavily accented but understandable English. "My granddaughter says you gave your last water, that you fix her leg when she was lost." Thomas nodded slowly. "I didn't know she was your granddaughter, sir. I just found her injured and couldn't leave her to suffer." The chief's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at being addressed as sir by a white man. He turned and spoke rapidly to his warriors, who immediately dispersed, some disappearing back into the desert, others taking positions around the canyon entrance. "I am Chief Neshe of the Tonto Apache," the old man said, his dignity palpable despite his simple introduction. "The girl you saved is Nasha, daughter of my son who walks with the ancestors now. She wandered from our camp during a dust storm 2 days ago." He paused, studying Thomas's face carefully before continuing. "Many white men would have left her, or worse." The accusation in his words was subtle but clear. Thomas understood the atrocities committed against native children by some of his race. "I'm not many men," Thomas replied simply. I'm just one man who couldn't let a child die, no matter whose child she might be. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Warriors returned with water, blessed, cool water that Thomas drank gratefully, and food. A woman, perhaps Nash's mother, came and properly set the girl's broken leg. Using herbs and poultices unknown to Thomas but clearly effective, as the child's pain seemed to ease almost immediately. Thomas observed it all with a combination of relief and continued wariness. He had heard stories of Apache hospitality toward those who earned their respect, but he had also heard tales of prolonged torture for enemies. He still wasn't certain which category he fell into, despite the food and water they had provided. As the sun climbed higher, Chief Neshe approached Thomas again. "Come," he said simply, gesturing for Thomas to follow him out of the canyon. With no real choice, Thomas complied, leaving his gun belt behind at a subtle signal from one of the warriors. They walked in silence for perhaps half a mile, cresting a small rise that overlooked a broad valley below. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Spread across the valley floor was an Apache encampment of considerable size, dozens of wickiups, cooking fires, and hundreds of people going about their daily activities. "My people," Neshe said with quiet pride, 300 warriors strong plus women, children, elders. Thomas swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how completely he was at their mercy. If they had wanted him dead, he would have been dead already, that much was clear. But why show him their camp? What purpose did it serve? As if reading his thoughts, Neshe spoke again. "White man's army thinks we are few, thinks we are scattered. They do not know our strength here." Thomas remained silent, unsure how to respond to this revelation of information that military commanders would consider extremely valuable. "You wonder why I show you this," the chief continued, his gaze still fixed on the camp below. "I show you because you must understand the weight of what comes next." They returned to the canyon to find a strange gathering had assembled. The warriors had formed a line, each holding something in their hands. As Thomas approached, he realized with shock that each man held some form of payment: small nuggets of gold, silver jewelry, intricate beadwork, finely tanned hides. Chief Neshe stopped and turned to face Thomas. "You saved the child of our people when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Your canteen was nearly empty, yet you gave your last water. Such a debt must be repaid." Thomas shook his head quickly. "No, sir, there's no debt. I did what any decent man would do." A subtle smile crossed the chief's face. "Not any man, few men. You are called virgin, yes. The one who tracks but does not kill." Thomas blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "We know many things about those who cross our lands," Neshe interrupted. "We have watched you before from distances you never suspected. You have a reputation even among my people." He gestured to the line of warriors. "Each man brings an offering, not payment. We do not buy and sell lives as white men do, but a token of respect and alliance. From this day, you may travel Apache lands in peace. No harm will come to you from any who call me chief." One by one, the warriors approached, placing their offerings in a growing pile before Thomas. Gold nuggets that must have come from hidden mines the government would kill to discover. Silver pieces worked with incredible craftsmanship. Ceremonial items of obvious spiritual significance. Thomas stood transfixed, overwhelmed by the generosity and deeply uncomfortable with accepting such valuable gifts for what he considered a simple act of human decency. "I cannot take these things," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "The life of a child is beyond price, and I would have given my water freely 100 times over." Chief Neshe regarded him steadily. "To refuse would dishonor us and the debt we acknowledge, but I see your heart is troubled by this wealth." He considered for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "Take only what you need for your journey. 1 piece of gold to secure safe passage to your destination. The rest will remain with us, held in trust. Should you ever have need, send word to Neshe of the Tonto Apache, and what is yours will be given." Relief washed over Thomas. This compromise felt right. He had no desire for riches gained through what he saw as simple human kindness, but he understood enough of Apache culture to know that refusing entirely would cause offense. As the sun began its westward journey once more, Thomas prepared to depart. His canteen had been filled, his saddlebags replenished with provisions that would last well beyond Fort McDowell. Sergeant seemed rejuvenated after a day of rest and proper feeding. Little Nasha had been brought to see him off, her dark eyes now bright with health and a shy smile on her face. She held out a small item, a bracelet of finely woven horsehair with a single turquoise stone. Thomas accepted it with a formal nod, carefully tying it around his wrist. No words passed between them, but none were needed. Chief Nashe approached as Thomas mounted Sergeant. "You ride with the protection of the Tonto Apache now, Virgin Cowboy," the chief said, using the nickname with a certain ironic respect. "But I offer you this warning. Do not speak of what you have seen here. The soldiers at your fort would bring death to this valley if they knew." Thomas nodded solemnly. "No one will hear of this place from my lips. You have my word." Nashe studied him one last time, as if memorizing his features, then stepped back with a gesture of farewell. "Until our paths cross again, ride in peace." Thomas touched his hat brim in salute, then turned Sergeant toward the desert and the long ride ahead. As he crested the ridge that would take him out of sight of the Apache camp, Thomas paused for a moment to look back. The single gold nugget in his pocket weighed far less than the knowledge he now carried, of a people fighting desperately to preserve their way of life, of a debt he had never sought but had been granted nonetheless, of a connection forged through one simple act of humanity. The turquoise bracelet caught the fading sunlight as he adjusted his reins. Some men spent their entire lives searching for gold in these unforgiving mountains. Thomas had found something far more valuable: respect earned not through violence or conquest, but through compassion. The setting sun cast long shadows across the desert as Thomas urged Sergeant forward. Fort McDowell still lay a day's ride ahead, and beyond that, the uncertain future of a changing frontier. He did not know what challenges awaited him, but he rode with a lighter heart than he had in years. In a land where men often measured their worth by the notches on their guns, Thomas, Virgin Blackwood had found validation in the absence of such marks. And somehow, that felt like the greatest wealth of all. As man and horse disappeared into the gathering twilight, the spirit of the West, not the West of dime novels and exaggerated tales, but the true West of complex humanity and unexpected connections, rode with them. Thomas reached Fort McDowell the following evening, the events of the past 2 days seeming increasingly dreamlike with each passing mile. The fort bustled with the usual activity: soldiers drilling in the dusty parade ground, supply wagons being unloaded, civilians arguing with the quartermaster over prices and provisions. No one paid much attention to another weather-beaten rider arriving at the gates, which suited Thomas perfectly. He stabled Sergeant, ensuring the horse received proper care after their difficult journey, then made his way to the fort's modest saloon to wash away the trail dust with a whiskey and perhaps gather news before securing a room for the night. The saloon was half full, mostly with soldiers drinking away the monotony of frontier duty. Thomas claimed a corner table with his back to the wall, a habit formed through years of frontier caution. He ordered whiskey and a plate of whatever passed for dinner, then sat in companionable silence, listening to the conversations flowing around him. It wasn't long before he caught fragments that made his pulse quicken. Apache activity, increased sightings, preparing for something big. The soldiers at a nearby table were discussing recent reports of native movements in the territory, precisely the area Thomas had just traversed. A cavalry lieutenant, emboldened by whiskey and an audience of enlisted men, was holding forth with particular authority. "Colonels received intelligence that there's a large band gathering somewhere southeast of here. 300 warriors at least, they say, though I think that's exaggerated. Still, we're mounting a patrol at first light, going to sweep the whole region." Thomas kept his expression carefully neutral as he sipped his drink, but his mind raced. 300 warriors, exactly the number Chief Neche had revealed to him. This was no coincidence. Someone had spotted the gathering, or worse, the Apache camp had been betrayed by an informant. The memory of Nasha's shy smile and the chief's warning echoed in Thomas's mind. The soldiers at your fort would bring death to this valley if they knew. He had given his word that no information would come from his lips, and he intended to honor that promise. But sitting silently while a cavalry patrol rode to their potential slaughter, or worse, succeeded in their mission and brought destruction to women and children, sat uneasily with him. Thomas finished his meal slowly, considering his options. Direct intervention seemed impossible without revealing what he knew. Perhaps there was another way to honor both his word to the chief and his conscience. As darkness settled over the fort, Thomas made his way to the sutler's store, purchasing supplies with the gold nugget he'd accepted from the Apache. The shopkeeper's eyes widened at the raw gold, but Thomas merely mentioned a lucky find in the superstitions, a story plausible enough to avoid further questions. With his new supplies secured, Thomas returned to the stables under cover of night. The young stable boy was easily convinced to look the other way with a generous tip. Within an hour, Thomas and Sergeant were riding out of the fort's southern gate, offering the drowsy guard a story about pressing business in Tucson that couldn't wait until morning. Instead of taking the road south, however, Thomas veered east as soon as he was out of sight of the fort's sentries. He pushed Sergeant hard through the night, navigating by starlight and his intimate knowledge of the territory. If he could reach the canyon by dawn, he might be able to warn Chief Neche before the patrol began its sweep. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just days ago, he had been cautiously avoiding any contact with Apache warriors, and now he was risking a charge of treason to warn the very people the army considered enemies. But the faces of Nasha and her people had become real to him in a way that abstract notions of hostile Indians never could be. Dawn was breaking as Thomas approached the canyon where he had found Nasha. His heart sank as he discovered the place completely abandoned. No sign remained of the Apache presence save for the cold ashes of their fire. Had they already moved on? Or had they been warned by their own scouts about the impending patrol? Thomas hesitated only briefly before continuing toward the valley where he had seen the larger encampment. He needed to be certain. As he crested the ridge overlooking the valley, he pulled Sergeant to an abrupt halt. The valley floor, which had been filled with wickiups in activity just 2 days before, lay completely empty. Not a single structure remained. Relief washed over Thomas, followed quickly by admiration. The Apache had vanished completely, leaving no trace for the cavalry to find. Their skill at appearing and disappearing across this harsh landscape was legendary for good reason. Thomas was turning Sergeant to begin the long ride back to the fort when movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. 3 mounted Apache warriors materialized from what had appeared to be empty landscape, surrounding him before he could react. One he recognized immediately, a warrior who had been at Chief Neche's right hand during their previous encounter. The man raised his hand in greeting rather than threat. "Virgin Cowboy returns quickly," the warrior said in accented but clear English. "Chief Neche thought you might." Thomas explained rapidly about the cavalry patrol preparing to sweep the area. The warrior nodded, unsurprised. "We have many eyes and ears. We began moving as soon as you left us." He gestured to the empty valley. "By the time the blue coats arrive, they will find nothing but shadows and dust." The other warriors remained silent, their expressions unreadable, but Thomas sensed no hostility from them. "I gave my word I wouldn't reveal what I saw," Thomas said. "I wanted to be sure you knew about the patrol." The warrior studied Thomas for a long moment before responding. A man whose word holds strong even when tested is rare among any people. "Chief Neche judged you well." He reached into a pouch at his waist and extended his hand toward Thomas. "The chief said if you returned to give you this." In his palm lay a small leather amulet on a rawhide cord, simple in appearance but clearly significant. This marks you as a friend of the Tonto Apache. Should you encounter any of our people in your travels, show this and you will be treated as an ally. Thomas accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, placing it around his neck and tucking it beneath his shirt. The patrol leaves at first light, Thomas said. I should return before I'm missed. The warrior nodded. Ride west for 3 miles before turning south. The blue coats will take the eastern route first. You will avoid them. With that practical advice and a gesture that was half salute, half blessing, the three warriors wheeled their horses and seemed to melt back into the landscape, leaving Thomas alone once more. He followed their directions, pushing Sargent into a ground-eating lope that would return him to the fort by mid-morning. His absence had likely been noted by now, but with luck, his business in Tucson excuse would hold. Fortune favored Thomas that day. He arrived back at Fort McDowell to find it abuzz with activity, not because of his unauthorized departure, but because a stage had arrived with government officials from Washington. The resulting commotion provided perfect cover for Thomas to slip back in, stable Sargent, and establish himself in the saloon as if he'd been there all morning. When questioned later by a suspicious sergeant about his nighttime departure, Thomas spun a convincing tale about a prospecting partner in need of urgent supplies. The gold nugget he'd converted to cash at the sutler's store lent credibility to his story of mining interests. 3 days later, the cavalry patrol returned to the fort empty-handed and frustrated. Thomas sat quietly in the saloon, nursing a whiskey as the lieutenant from before complained bitterly about vanishing hostiles and wasted efforts. It's like they're ghosts, the officer declared to anyone who would listen. Every campsite cold, every trail at least 3 days old. They're out there somewhere, but damned if we can find them. Thomas hid his smile behind his glass. The frontier was changing rapidly, railroads pushing ever westward, more settlers arriving each month, the old ways diminishing beneath the relentless march of progress. But for now, at least, Chief Neche and his people had maintained their freedom. As weeks passed and then months, Thomas continued his life as a tracker and occasional bounty hunter, but with one significant difference. The amulet around his neck opened doors previously closed to him. Twice he encountered small bands of Apache who, upon seeing the chief's token, shared information that made his tracking work considerably easier. Once, when wounded after a confrontation with a particularly desperate fugitive, he was found by an Apache hunting party who recognized the amulet and treated his injuries before helping him deliver his bounty to the nearest settlement. The gold held in trust by Chief Neche remained untouched. Thomas had no need for it, but the respect he had earned proved far more valuable in the unforgiving territories. The story of the virgin cowboy, who had somehow gained the trust of the Apache, spread across the frontier in typical fashion, growing more exaggerated with each telling. Some claimed he had saved an entire village from smallpox. Others insisted he had single-handedly fought off a band of renegades to protect an Apache child. The truth, a simple act of compassion from one human being to another, was both less dramatic and more profound than any of the tall tales. Thomas never corrected the stories, let people believe what they would. The truth resided in the small turquoise bracelet he still wore, and in the memories he carried of a little girl's smile and a chief's weathered handshake. Years later, long after the last Apache bands had been forced onto reservations, an aging Thomas Blackwood sat on the porch of a modest ranch house south of Tucson. The frontier had vanished, tamed by barbed wire, railroads, and the relentless tide of settlement. The amulet still hung around his neck, though he had encountered no free Apache in nearly a decade. As the sun set over the western mountains, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, a single rider approaching his property. Thomas watched with interest as the figure drew closer. The rider was a young Apache man, perhaps 20 years old, sitting tall and proud on a government-issue horse despite wearing the plain clothes of the reservation. When the young man reached the gate, he dismounted and approached with formal dignity. "I seek Thomas Blackwood," he called, the one they called Virgin Cowboy. Thomas rose slowly from his chair, joints protesting the movement. I'm Blackwood, he acknowledged, though it's been many years since anyone called me by that name. The young man nodded and introduced himself as Joseph, grandson of Chief Neche and son of Nasha. He had been sent on a special journey, permitted by the Indian agent only after weeks of petitioning. Chief Neche had died the previous winter, and before passing to the spirit world, he had given his grandson a final mission. Joseph reached into a leather pouch and produced a small parcel wrapped in soft deerskin. My grandfather said that a debt was owed and a promise must be kept, even after his death. He said you would understand. Thomas accepted the package with trembling hands, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a substantial gold nugget, far larger than the one he had accepted all those years ago, along with a small carved stone bear. The gold is yours by right, Joseph explained. The bear was my mother's final gift. She never forgot the man who gave his last water to a lost child. Thomas stood silently, the weight of the gold in his palm nothing compared to the weight of the memories flooding back. How is your mother? He asked finally. Joseph's expression softened. She walks with a slight limp still, but she has lived a good life. She has 3 children and 2 grandchildren now. She teaches the old ways as best she can, despite the government school's efforts. A shadow crossed his face. Our people struggle on the reservation. The land is poor, the water scarce. But we endure as we always have. Thomas nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken about the conditions the proud Apache now endured. Come inside, Thomas said, gesturing toward his door. Share a meal before you ride back. The journey to the reservation is long. Joseph hesitated only briefly before accepting the invitation. As they sat at Thomas's simple table, sharing coffee and a meal of beef stew, the young man spoke of his people's circumstances with remarkable candor, the poverty, the restrictions, the gradual erosion of their traditions. Thomas listened without interruption, recognizing the trust being extended to him in this honest accounting. When Joseph finished speaking, Thomas rose and went to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, returning with a folded document. This land, Thomas said, tapping the deed on the table, 300 acres with good water and grazing. I've held it for years but never built on it. It borders the reservation to the south, land the government considers worthless because of the rough terrain, but land that once belonged to your people. He pushed the deed across the table. I'm an old man with no family to inherit. When I'm gone, this document will ensure the land returns to the Tonto Apache if your people want it. Joseph stared at the deed in astonishment, then at Thomas's weathered face. Why would you do this? Thomas touched the turquoise bracelet on his wrist, faded but still intact after all these years. A kindness freely given often returns in unexpected ways, he said simply. Your grandfather taught me that. Perhaps this land will provide your people with resources the reservation lacks. Perhaps it will offer a place where the old ways can be practiced away from government eyes. Or perhaps it will simply serve as a reminder that not all promises between peoples are broken. Joseph carefully folded the deed and placed it securely inside his shirt, his expression solemn with the responsibility he now carried. As dusk deepened into night, Joseph prepared to leave, needing to reach a predetermined campsite before full dark. Thomas walked with him to his horse, the gold nugget and carved bear safely tucked into the young man's saddlebag alongside the precious deed. Tell your mother, Thomas said as Joseph mounted, that her kindness as a child taught an old cowboy more about courage and dignity than all his years on the frontier. Tell her that her father's wisdom has guided me well. Joseph nodded, committing the message to memory. I will tell her, and I will tell my children of Thomas Blackwood, the virgin cowboy who kept his word. With those parting words, Joseph turned his horse toward the east and rode into the gathering darkness. Thomas remained by the gate long after the rider had disappeared from view, watching as stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky. The frontier of his youth had vanished, transformed into something his younger self would scarcely recognize. But standing there beneath the eternal stars, Thomas felt a profound connection to the land and its people that transcended the artificial boundaries of reservation lines and property deeds. One small act of compassion, water shared with a dying child, had created ripples that continued to spread across the years, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. Thomas Virgin Blackwood died peacefully in his sleep the following winter. As stipulated in his will, the turquoise bracelet was buried with him, but the amulet from Chief Neche was returned to the Tonto Apache. The 300 acres he had deeded to them became a place of quiet resistance and cultural preservation, a small victory in a time of tremendous loss. And in the oral tradition of the Apache, the story was passed down through generations. The tale of a cowboy who valued a child's life above his own comfort, and the unexpected alliance born from that simple human connection. In the changing landscape of the American West, where mythology often overshadowed reality, it remained one of the rare stories that grew more meaningful with each telling precisely because it was true. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.